Hello everyone, my name is Katie Wright. I'm in the Department of Social Inquiry at Trobe University, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating this afternoon's conversation about wellbeing and education. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and it's these lands which are also home to the Melbourne campus of Trobe University. Trobe proudly acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands where our campuses are located across Victoria. We recognise that Indigenous Australians have an ongoing connection to the land, and the university values their unique contribution both to the university and to the wider Australian society. I pay my respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, and I extend this respect to any First Nations people joining us today. Thank you everyone here who has made the time to come along this evening, and you're very welcome to this event. This is the second event organised by the Wellbeing Research Cluster, which is supported by the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Trobe University. Last week we held a webinar which focused on the importance of thinking about wellbeing in relational terms, and it was a really terrific event. So if you're interested in this, you can find a link to the recording on the Trobe University events page. Before I introduce our two speakers, I'll just say something very briefly about the format of this evening's event and about the Wellbeing Research Cluster, which has made this event possible. So firstly, to the cluster. The name of our cluster is Wellbeing Critical Social Perspectives, which will give you some indication of the sorts of questions that we're engaged with. The cluster brings together social science and humanities researchers from across Trobe University who share an interest in thinking critically about wellbeing. And this includes thinking about the concept of wellbeing itself. In other words, what does wellbeing actually mean and what does it look like? How can it best be measured? And how can we work to ensure that wellbeing interventions achieve their desired outcomes? Cluster members are involved in a range of projects related to these questions. And as you know, or at least many of you here will know, both in Australia and internationally, there's been increasing attention in recent years to developing more critical angles on wellbeing. And I'm delighted that we have two esteemed colleagues with us today. Two scholars who have both in different ways turned their attention to this question, specifically in relation to how the concept of wellbeing is deployed in education and in schooling contexts. So it's my great pleasure to firstly introduce and welcome Professor Venka Simovska. Venka is a professor in school development, learning and wellbeing at the Danish School of Education at Aarhus University in Copenhagen. Venka is a member of the Steering Committee for the Schools for Health in Europe Research Group and a co-convener for the Health and Wellbeing Education Research Network within the European Educational Research Association. Venka's work is interdisciplinary and her research interests combine educational theory, psychology, and health and wellbeing promotion. Her research involves qualitative and plural approaches within interpretive and post-critical paradigms. Thank you so much, Venka, for agreeing to this early start to your day and for joining us in this conversation about wellbeing and education.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks for the invitation. My pleasure.
It also gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Julie McLeod. Julie is Professor in Curriculum, Equity and Social Change in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and she's also Pro Vice-Chancellor Research Capability at the University of Melbourne. Julie's research is in the history and sociology of education, and it's guided by a focus on how identities and social possibilities are differentially shaped by school experiences. Theoretically and methodologically, Julie's work is characterised less by an adherence to specific hero theorists and more by a critical engagement with a range of theoretical debates that help illuminate particular problems and dilemmas, including wellbeing. And thank you so much, Julie, for joining us today.
I'll unmute. Thank you, Katie. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation and to join with Venka as well. So thank you very much, and to the cluster.
Thank you both. So the format of this event is a conversation and we'll have just under an hour. I have the pleasure of asking our guests a number of questions, and they will no doubt be prompted to ask each other questions and perhaps raise their own. We'll then open it up to questions and comments from the audience. So as this is a webinar, you'll only see the panelists on screen, but you will have an opportunity to participate as an audience member in this conversation by adding a question or a comment or both. And you can do this by using the Q&A button that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Do feel free to add questions or comments at any time. You don't need to wait till the end. And we will get to those, as many of those as we can, after we've had the questions that I'll be asking our guests. I think that just about covers the introductions and housekeeping. So now I'm going to launch into my questions, and I'd like to begin by asking both of you, Julie and Venka, about your broad areas of research in education and perhaps beyond, and how you came to be interested specifically in the topic of wellbeing in education. And perhaps we could begin with Venka as our international participant.
Thank you. I'm honored. It's early morning here in Copenhagen, so I hope my brain will catch up fast. My research has, over the last many years, has been within health education and health promotion in schools, with a particular focus on student engagement, student participation and agency, or what we called at that time, and still a little bit, action competence or critical health literacy. There are a number of conceptualizations of this. So the processes and outcomes, learning outcomes of this health education and health promotion in schools. And this has been within the paradigm of health promoting schools in Europe, but also globally. And as you said, Katie, in your introduction, I have been heavily involved within the research group of related to this paradigm or this initiative. The initiative involves, I think, 48 countries in WHO European region, here in Europe, and with the representatives of policymakers, and from both sectors, health and education. And in relation to this initiative, we have established a research group of scholars engaging with research related to this. So in that sense, for me, health has always been kind of defined or understood not in biomedical terms, but in socio-ecological terms, closely related to well-being. And it was very natural for me to also use the term well-being whenever I would talk about health education. But it wasn't widely spread, I must say, until recently, because in policy, in practice, and also in research, the biomedical paradigm or discourse remained dominant, and the traditional health topics were mostly researched or talked about, such as nutrition, physical activity, mental health, even, and so on and so forth. So I had always to explain, even to my colleagues at the university, no, I'm not a health researcher, I'm a well-being researcher and educational researcher. But this was difficult until recently, and I guess we will talk about that more, until 2014, 13, 14, when this turn happened in Denmark, but also across the world, towards well-being.
Yes, I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on the wellbeing turn, and we will come to that later. So yeah, thank you, Venka. And Julie, perhaps over to you about your a snapshot of your research and actually, wellbeing.
Very interesting, Venka, because I think we have quite a different lineage in how we've come to the signifier or the problem of wellbeing, the issue of wellbeing. And I suppose if someone had said to me 15 years ago, you'll be writing on wellbeing, I would have been completely perplexed how that could have happened given my research interests. But as I was trying to piece it together, I think I've always had an interest in, particularly in the educational field, in ideas about the inner life of children and young people, and the sort of the influential ideas and constructs that name and try and understand what is going on inside people, young people. And so, well, I come to wellbeing as part of that, if you like, psychosocial, or that sort of mysterious thing that education tries to address. And so I will be talking about my work with Katie, because we're working together for a long time on a particular historical project on the history of adolescence. And in that, we were trying to understand changing ideas across the mid-20th century about the norms of the good student. And inversely, in a way, what constituted the student who fell outside those norms. And so we looked at changing ideas about what being a good student looked like, and then as part of being what is a good future citizen. And through that emerged a strong focus on the sort of, if you like, the psychological underpinnings of that. And obviously a lot of dialogue with Katie on that. So it's that mix of trying to understand the history of ideas about inner life, about what counts as a good normative, what are the norms of being a good student, and what are the sort of, systems of ideas about young people and children, and what enables and what constrains them through schooling. So, but I'll come back to a little bit more on that later, but that's where I've come from.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Julie. So maybe this is the first of the trick questions or the difficult questions that I'm going to ask you, even though it sounds like a simple one. As we know, those of us who work with this concept of wellbeing know it's widely deployed, but not always clear what is meant by wellbeing. So I thought early on in the discussion, it might be useful for us to talk about definitional issues and perhaps ask both of you what wellbeing means to you, how you think about wellbeing, whether it's in conceptual terms or another way that you might come at it. So perhaps Venka, I could ask you first how you what does wellbeing mean to you in your research? How do you use and operationalize this concept?
Yes, a tough question, because I'm constantly trying to do that actually in my work. So I don't have a definition, but I can tell you about how I think, or how I tend to think about it. First of all, I think of well-being as a process, a dynamic process, always in a movement rather than a static state. I think about well-being as relational rather than individual only. I think about it as an assemblage, including individual, social, material, discursive dimensions. Also, I think inspired by neurocognitive science, recently I've been playing a little bit with the characteristics of well-being being inactive, embodied, embedded, and extended. And then I don't know if I need to kind of focus this a little bit more. I would say that I try to conceptualize well-being as a dynamic entanglement of a sense of being, sense of belonging or multiple belongings, and sense of becoming. This is the subjective kind of part of well-being, and then this is situated in my research in a whole school environment, material as well as social school environment. And to add, to top that, connected to the purposes, I try to think also well-being as connected or disconnected from the purposes of education, as edification, or as we call it here, Bildung, the formation of the subject. So this would be my suggestion to start with, and over to you, Julie.
Gosh, how to add to that incredibly suggestive and very evocative understanding of well-being, which already takes us away from some of the more formulaic conceptions of well-being that, normally we have the well-being and mental health couplet, if you like, and you're really talking about something very comprehensive actually about, as you say, your subjectivity, but then it also, as you were going off to the end, about purposes of schooling. So I can see it does a lot of work in how you're engaging with it. And so that has really helped me think a bit about, on the spot, about how I think about it. And I have to say, I'm never quite, as you said, I don't really know how I mean it, because largely I'm looking at how it's engaged in the public and pedagogical sphere. So, and what I see, of course, is it's quite a mobile movement, a mobile term, one of those traveling, so one of those big traveling concepts. When I say traveling, I mean across place, you know, transnationally, but also across time. And so it is really the history of the changing meanings and investments in well-being and what the work it is meant to do, the problems it's intended to solve. And again, looking back on some work that Katie and I were doing, it was a very sort of startling thing we were observing, was how when well-being shifts from being an attribute of a society or an economy, you know, the prosperity and well-being, national well-being, to becoming predominantly an attribute of individuals. So it's those sorts of movements that I'm interested in, and then how you can use well-being to achieve a huge amount of reform agendas in school, for better or for worse. So it can be mobilized, well, it's both mobile, time, place, but can be mobilized and put to work to achieve really disparate aims. So that's why I think it's a kind of one of those words you need to follow, because it's never stable. And the fact that it's not pinned downable is its virtue. Well, you know, in a pragmatic sense. Yeah. So that's probably a bit evasive, but thanks for the tough question.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more. I mean, I think it's so interesting to think about it from that perspective, rather than what we're often used to, which is, you know, us trying to define what well-being is. And Venka, you offered a beautifully rich description of ways that we can think about that. And then Julie, building on that by thinking about, you know, an alternative way at coming at that question of sort of what it is in terms perhaps more of what well-being does.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we could pick up on some of those things in terms of, Julie, a lot of your work is historical, and you've looked at these changing patterns in education over time and changing agendas and those sorts of things. So I guess what really, you've mentioned that the shift from objective sort of measures of well-being to well-being being understood as an attribute of individuals was one striking thing. Are there other things that you'd noticed thinking in a kind of longer historical sense about purposes of schooling, educational trends and changing ideas, that sort of thing? You know, when does this start to happen, and how is it related to other changes, I guess?
Yeah, no, it is interesting and also a bit hard as well, because because of the sorts of things that well-being stands for at different times. So one of in more recent history, I was very interested in things like the self-esteem movement, sort of in secondary, well, if particularly linked to feminist agendas, where if we think of well-being as about self-actualizing, you know, like who I am, and I might talk a bit about that later as well. But if we go back earlier to sort of the interwar period and through to the 1930s and 40s, and the rise of concerns about schools' role in caring for people. So that not even a shift, but the ways in which school is primarily understood as a site of instruction, and when it becomes also very much concerned with care and support for people. And I think it's potentially, you know, possibly always been doing elements of both, but it's when they're differently emphasized at different times, I think. Again, that probably links to what does link to what Venka was saying about the social purposes of, or the larger purposes of schooling and the social purposes of schooling, when well-being as partly about producing well-rounded, fully adjusted, sort of well-adjusted and fully rounded subjects, school student subjects, is also linked to how we make robust, strong citizens for the future. So I'm as much interested in the social artifacts or benefits of attention to well-being as about the personal attending to your sort of inner life, your sort of the psychological dimensions of well-being in that respect. And I think that was very strong in the interwar period, the 30s and 40s, and a very strong focus on schooling and citizenship then.
And then later that becomes named as well-being, that those sorts of...
But it wasn't a sort of, that's why it's sort of hard to say, because it wasn't a concept deployed at that time. It was understood very differently.
Yeah. It's fascinating to think about it in those terms.
Yeah.
And Venka, in Denmark, I'm not sure if your work has a historical component, but even just thinking in more recent times, how well-being has become such a sort of key concern of schools and so prominent in policy. I wonder if you could reflect on us and perhaps tell us a bit about what you see as those sort of shifts happening in Denmark, either over a longer period or in more recent years.
Yes, thank you. My research is not historical, and therefore I'm very much inspired by your work, Julie, as you know, and your work with Katie. And but I have been digging a little bit into the philosophical kind of origins, if we can say, origins of well-being, and going into philosophy of Greek philosophy of ancient times. So theoretically, philosophically, there this, and also in the literature, it's not my invention, there this kind of dichotomy between the so-called hedonic or eudaimonic line of thinking about well-being, where hedonic is more the line of thinking as a pleasure over pain, like well-being is absence of pain and kind of presence or chase for pleasure and happiness. And then the eudaimonic, with reference to Aristotle, is refers more to well-being as becoming your true self, as a kind of life of meaning, purpose, and virtue. So as we kind of look at the literature of well-being globally, if we take this analytical perspective, then we could see lines like positive psychology, the happiness research, which has been also very present here in Denmark. You know that Denmark has been declared the happiest nation in the world for years, but also mental health line of research. I would say all within the hedonic line of conceptualization. And then on the other side, maybe the neurocognitive sciences, the 4E that I mentioned, the embodied, the extended, the inactive way of thinking about well-being, or the quality of life movement, which is also global, which includes more societal measures of well-being, economic and political, and so on and so forth. The capabilities movement with Nussbaum and Sen also. So more eudaimonic line of thinking, which takes the kind of the broader social context into account. And this, I think, relates to your interests, Julie, and the historical genealogical take on development, movement, travel of the concept.
Yes.
So, and if I should then briefly touch upon Denmark. Well-being entered the educational agenda just recently in 2014. There is a clear kind of rupture or moment in time when this happened with the latest educational reform of primary and lower secondary school in Denmark, which named well-being as one of the pillars of the reform, along with the educational attainment and inclusion. So the whole reform was made, initiated so that Denmark would do better on the international PISA comparison testing, and well-being was kind of put in as an instrumental tool in this. I guess you have a lot to say, and this is where we come to this, what well-being does rather than what well-being is, and I think you have a lot to say on that, Julie.
Well, no, I'm not so sure, but I think that's a very interesting coincidence globally. Like, I can't necessarily name that a particular time, like 2014. I suppose I could if I had all the policies next to me, but that way in which well-being becomes, the increasing focus on it corresponds, that's all I'll say, corresponds with the increasing anxiety about and faith in testing. So on the one hand, you can look at well-being as trying to provide a counterpoint to testing, to thinking about the whole child, but then it also is a vehicle for ensuring you'll perform better. So if you're sort of well-adjusted and have well-being, you're likely to be more successful. So that is very much, I think you could do a bit of a random check on most school websites in Australia, at least in Victoria, and you're going to find variations of that discourse as part of their market offering, if you like.
Yes, exactly. And in Denmark, the national survey, well-being survey, was introduced along with the reform to monitor well-being. So all the students in all the schools all over Denmark fill this survey once a year on an annual basis. And then lists are made, the rankings of the schools according to this well-being measurement. So it became one of the new technologies, social technologies of testing and evidence. And it's not only in Denmark, even OECD PISA test, I guess Australia is also part of that, was heavily criticized for this measurement regime on the main subjects in schools, but then they introduced the PISA well-being, kind of to respond to the critique, but to kind of preemptively disarm the critique. So now we also have OECD PISA well-being measurement globally, which is highly problematic, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That brings me very nicely to my question, is when we think about well-being, we have this sense of it being a sort of innately good thing. And, as Julie and I have talked about, it's hard to argue against well-being. And I don't think that's what any of us are doing. I think we all share the same aspirations for people to be well and to have good lives. But there is something, and you've alluded to it in the points that you've raised already, there is something problematic about well-being and a need for a critical lens. So I wonder if you could build on those points that you've just raised about the intersections with testing and performative culture and the ways in which we need to think about well-being critically so that it doesn't become just caught up in, I guess, another one of these testing technologies or another component of schooling that has a certain set of aims but kind of fails to achieve them because of the kind of web in which it's caught or the other purposes to which well-being is put, perhaps.
Thank you. Did you want to kick off that one?
Thank you. If you are letting me start, I've been playing with this dichotomy, and I've been criticized for using dichotomies too much, but I have been playing with this dichotomy between transformative versus tyrannical or oppressive potential of the concept of well-being in terms of what it does. Of course, it's difficult to argue against well-being and against well-being in schools and in schooling. And it's kind of, it could be helpful to improve the school environments, the totality of children's experience in schools, but it could also turn into its opposite, as you say, Katie, and undermine the very aims that it's meant to achieve or help achieving, and become oppressive with the measurement regimes, with the comparison regimes, even for students with normative assumptions about what it means to thrive well or to not to thrive in school. And this has already had some consequences in Denmark, because if we look at the survey itself, in the questions, there are very strong norms about what it means to score highly on this well-being questionnaire, which leaves, I believe, the children with a sense of being wrong, or somehow something being wrong with them. They internalize this lack of well-being, even though maybe this is not their experience. Like the questions include, for example, how many friends do you have? And the message is, the more friends, the higher well-being. And of course, many children thrive with only one friend, and so there are very strong normative kind of assumptions there, which affect students' subjectivities. There's strong oppression on schools. Now parents, when they select schools, they look at these results on the survey, and schools are ranked and so on and so forth. They are forced or pushed into initiating interventions in schools to improve the well-being. So then we have a whole range of new individualistic interventions, such as mindfulness, meditation, yoga, and you name it, to improve, ameliorate this situation. So this transformative versus oppressive potential of the concept is at play, I would say, and I'm actually very much interested to go into observing and exploring this deeper in schools. Unfortunately, my latest grant application on this has been rejected, so there is not much interest among the funders to fund this, but yeah, I hope I will be able to do that one way or another.
I think we would perhaps overlap a bit in that approach as well. And I suppose just to be explicit about the sorts of frameworks that I bring to this, you can probably detect that I'm a pretty old school Foucauldian in some ways about how I think, there is a sort of an ethical good, an ethical responsibility for educators in particular, and for school educators, but all educators, to really try and understand the everyday buzzwords, concepts, keywords that just enter almost invisibly into our practice. And so some of my teaching is with pre-service teachers, and also with people coming back, experienced teachers, and generally they're incredibly accomplished in their field, and so it's trying to prise open a bit of some of those taken for granted. So what actually is wellbeing doing? Just sort of what is happening here? So I'm interested in that aspect of it, in the kind of almost, if you like, it's how it's put to work pedagogically, and what our responsibilities are to try and understand the everyday of schooling. And I suppose in a more classic sociological way, I am interested in not only that it tends to be an individualizing strategy, where you might say, as Venka's document sort of touched on, is how individuals become responsible for their lack of well-being, rather than the fact that they may be in an under-resourced school, or they're experiencing all kinds of other reasons for not feeling connected or not feeling a sense of belonging. But I'm been trying to work through how it's actually, to pick up that word, transforming, or subtly starting to change the way we even think of what the individual is. So, you know, it's the individualizing and the remaking of the individual at the same time. It's kind of what I'm interested in. And that's sort of going back to that earlier interest in what I was saying, you know, how we understand or name and theorize this sort of inner life of the child.
Thinking about the ways in which, you know, both of you talked about the sorts of things that are going on in schools, and that leads us to questions about teaching approaches, and Julie, you picked up on this in maybe a more sophisticated way than the question I'm about to ask, but I'm wondering if there are links that you have thought about or considered perhaps between different teaching styles or pedagogical approaches to learning. So, for example, inquiry-based learning, whether there are different ways of engaging with children that teachers might adopt that might promote or inhibit well-being. If either of you, I mean, whoever would like to take that question. Julie, you start. Oh,
okay. I just noticed my internet was freezing a bit, so let me know if I disappear. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Again, do those inquiry, or at least I would think another way to talk about it might be student-led, or, you know, child-centered, inquiry-based, where either, you know, I think this is what it might mean. I'm not entirely sure whether the object that is being inquired about, you know, is determined by the child. So that sort of gives a lot of accent on the individual desires, or, you know, the importance of respecting and acknowledging that as a way of keeping children engaged in schooling. And therefore an engaged child is a child with a lot of well-being. I mean, I think that's partly, now I don't know whether that is in fact the logic, but that's one sort of connection between those, because, you know, pedagogies or ways of teaching and thinking about learning or the child, they are all implicitly connected to how we view what will work for the child. It's called a theory of learning, as if the learning is separate from the child, but actually they're really about how will the child learn. Do you know, it's so, yeah.
It's also, you say, Julie, it's separate from the child. We talk about theories of learning, but from my perspective, it's also separated from teaching. True. There is a teaching and there is a learning, and these are kind of interconnected closely, yeah. Especially when we talk about schools. Yeah. And the paradigm, the initiative of the health promoting schools that I mentioned at the beginning works with the notion of a whole school environment, not only with the curriculum, so that children don't only learn in classes and in specific pedagogies, but they learn from being at school, from moving across the different time, space, social interactions at school. So when I wouldn't talk about specific pedagogies, which are more or less related to learning, but about a whole school environment and the pedagogical culture, the ethos, the culture, the feeling of the school, which could be more or less related or conducive to well-being. But of course, within this philosophy, student participation or engagement or involvement is crucial. And in the definition of well-being that I tentatively mentioned about being, belonging, becoming, I add there an element of the student's possibility to have influence over these domains. So the more influence or agency children have at school, I would say this could be seen as more conducive or linked to well-being. So the whole school environment, including the pedagogies, rather than specific teaching strategies. I would be more interested in.
And in some ways that raises the question too about how different approaches or interventions might operate at different levels of schooling. So we've talked about children. Julie, a lot of your work is with adolescents and young people, and I guess it raises the question of what wellbeing looks like, or what approaches to promoting wellbeing looks like at different levels of schooling. And I wondered if you had some thoughts on that, or have given any consideration to that question.
So at different levels of schooling or across the education sector?
Well, I guess it could be both. I mean, there's different levels of schooling when we think about children's age, for example, and primary schools versus secondary schools, or even in tertiary education, I guess. But it seems to me that wellbeing has different sorts of manifestations at different levels, and that it doesn't look the same necessarily in terms of promotional strategies or what it might look like in children or young people necessarily, if they're very young children or if they're adolescents, for example. So I guess it's the question about whether you think that whether it changes throughout the life of the child, I guess, as well as across different settings.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I've also been thinking about it in relation to higher education, but that's a slightly different thing. But I think, one thing that does spring to mind on that is, the way in which it might coincide with, the way in which it does coincide with the more established developmental trajectories of children, so there's certain types of crises around adolescence, or sort of, middle school style adolescence, year 8, 9, 10, that level. But I suppose it's when well-being is talked about in terms of risk, where absence of well-being, the risk of that is the consequential risks of that are heightened, obviously, I think from middle high school onwards, where, so that's, I know a lot more about that, but my observations, and this is verging on the anecdotal about primary school, is that it's I think it's more likely creating a positive environment. Not so much about risk factors, but about, protective factors, perhaps. And whereas absence of well-being is more and more construed in that language of risk and mitigation.
Similar, I would say, here in Denmark, although here in Denmark, this creating positive environments in practice, in educational practice, is mostly visible in preschool, while already in primary school, unfortunately, this is not in the Danish history of schooling, which has always been more concerned about the whole school, the whole child, and so on. But now with the neoliberal kind of tendencies, Danish schools are changing, and even the discourses of well-being in primary schools and lower secondary schools focus on prevention of bullying, for example, or promoting integration, or fostering inclusion, and this continues in high school and in the next educational level, where it kind of gets expanded to digital bullying, to sharing of sexualized images online, the social media, and so on and so forth. The practice and the policy and practice discourses are mostly risk, still, I'm afraid to say, risk oriented, and there are some countering tendencies, and then in high school, I think mostly, at least in Denmark, the discourse is about once a year survey and talking about the study environment. There are no interventions, there are no serious substantial efforts of improving well-being there, although there is a lot of talking about it.
That's very interesting, thinking about it in terms of risk, because one of the risks that looms large for secondary school students is mental health problems, and I think we see a real alignment and an emphasis on the kind of mental health end of wellbeing interventions as children enter into high schools as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. But the other risk is there's the mental health risk, and I think increasing the risk of underperformance. You know, so that it's the risk of not being successful.
Yes, there's the whole tension there also that I mentioned, this health promotion and health education, or well-being promotion or well-being education. Is it the health agenda, mental health or well-being, or is it educational agenda? And the educational agenda can also be instrumental in academic achievement and testing and comparisons, but it could also well-being could also connect to the wider purposes of education, as I mentioned, such as subjectification. And this is the struggle, and this is the kind of the research that I'm interested in. So far, the schools, the health agenda dominates, I would say, while the wider purposes of education are losing ground in practices and policies.
I'm conscious of the time, so I'd like to remind audience members, if you've got a question, to please include that in the Q&A, and we can ask those questions of Venka and Julie. But first, I would like to go back to some specific aspects of research that you both do, and I might start with you, Julie. You mentioned the historical work and self-esteem, and you've done some work looking at differences and similarities, I guess, between the self-esteem movement of the 1970s and what later is well-being.
Can you hear me?
You just cut out for a second, but I think you're okay now. So if your internet holds up, maybe you can say something about what you were doing with that piece of research that was making sort of links or comparisons between well-being and self-esteem.
Okay. Again, I'm sorry, my internet was cutting in and out. So I did pick up, I think the question is the relationship between well-being focus and then the self-esteem movement. Was that the question? Yep. Great. So yeah, I did, as you said, touch on that. And again, that was a kind of almost one of those nice sort of serendipitous or accidental things I started looking at. And I had done quite a bit of work when I was looking at the history of feminism in schooling on the self-esteem movement, which was a really key part of feminist interventions into schooling in the 80s, and into the 90s, where the solutions for girls underrepresentation or girls inequality, whole other ways of explaining it, was linked very much to their self-esteem and to the need for, so self-esteem there has got a very social dimension. So it's the social context which is limiting their sense of who they can be. And so on the one hand, if we, at the time, many feminists, and probably including myself, educators were highly critical of the self-esteem movement because they saw it as just completely individualizing, as just blaming young women, blaming girls, not looking at the social structures. You can foresee where the arguments were going, and that it wasn't, so on the one hand, we're holding up, you can do it. If anyone saw these math posters, you can do it. And, teachers of all the sort of advice to teachers was, sometimes they use the language empower, but it was to, open up show girls what they can do. Girls can do anything. So there's this kind of empowerment language. And then there's a critique, which is self-esteem is blaming the individual in simple terms. However, when I look back on that from the vantage point of 2015, 16, and in the sort of immersion in well-being, which is also about you know, to some extent, self-regard, how one thinks about oneself, how one sees oneself in the world, sense of possibility, capacity to affect change. I began to look at self-esteem in the self-esteem movement in a very different way. And I felt, in a way, I wouldn't say necessarily less critical, but, you know, I saw it perhaps more as having more positive, that sort of ambivalence around transformation and tyranny, as Venka was talking about. So it was very interested in the transformative possibilities that self-esteem did afford, and the way in which it was very much connected to a collective political project, collective ethical and political project of feminism, in a way that something like well-being doesn't have necessarily that sort of collective social movement dimension. It's very much about improving individuals.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. And Venka, my question specifically about your research is, as we all know, the measurement of well-being is a difficult, well, it's both grown, but also is an area subject to critique. And I know you've done some thinking about measuring well-being and how that might be done differently. What are the, I guess, the affordances of that, the problems with that, and then what some alternatives might look like. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little, please.
Yes, I actually kind of created a so-called research protocol to do research into the existing measurement regime in Denmark, but also internationally. But a little alternative protocol to see how these surveys come into being, how the making of the measurements of well-being, and a little wider look at who are the actors involved, who are the social actors involved in this creation, what are the interests at stake there, and there I plan to use Latour a little bit, actor network theory, how these actors connect, what are also the non-human actors and how they affect what becomes a measurement tool or a survey. So to look at the process of the making of the survey and kind of deconstructing or unpacking the interests there, with the view of actually exploring what this measurement does, rather than how it measures or it doesn't, what is intended to measure. So that's one line of research that I'm engaging in at the moment, and the other is you asked what the alternatives could be. For me, of course, not all the measurement is bad. Again, we have these transformative and oppressive, tyrannical potentials, because the attention on well-being per se is positive, I would say. But how we go about it and how do we treat the results is what matters. So in that sense, for me, it's more interesting to measure what are the affordances of the school environment to kind of to promote or to create spaces for well-being for children, not only for them to feel well or to thrive at school, but to also critically relate to or reflect upon what well-being means to them, and what are the spaces at school for them to become who they are in the face of plurality and difference. If I can quote Gert Bista in his subjectification definition of subjectification. So these are my interests when it comes to maybe not measurements, but observing. But even measurements, if we are to measure, I would rather measure the characteristics of the school, the spaces that the school affords for these kind of processes, reflections, and and students' subjectifications. So how students become subjects of action and responsibility in relation to well-being, but also in the face of unknown futures and in the context of others different from themselves.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it, and alternatively about wellbeing measures, which are so kind of pervasive, shifting, not trying, as I understand it, to develop an alternative measure then, but to think about what we're doing with the measurements and looking, away from just measuring the attributes or of the individual child, but thinking in it in a much more holistic way. Would that be a fair characterization?
I think so, yes. And also, you said it. What do we do with all these results? I have a PhD student at the moment who is taking these well-being survey results to children in schools and then discussing them, the results, but also the questions and so on and so forth. So different ways of engaging with all these so-called evidence or data that the measurement movement produces.
I guess that leads very nicely to a question that I wanted to finish up with, which is how we can think about well-being critically in the sorts of ways that we've been discussing, and move things forward in a way that helps us to achieve the sorts of well-being aims that I think we all share, whether it's children or young people or other populations, but ways of trying to achieve the well-being that I think is a common aspiration without undermining it. And I think you've covered beautifully some of the problems with the way that well-being is deployed in educational settings at the moment, particularly in terms of measurements, but also in more subtle ways about the ways in which we think about children and young people. And I guess it would be nice to finish up with some reflections, if you have any, about how we can try and achieve these wellbeing aims without undermining undermining that in the process.
Yeah. It's a very interesting question to pose as well during this year. And if we think about the well-being of the child and the school environment, where we've been part of an unusual social experiment where we've had school taken away, if you're living in Victoria, or a different type of relationship to the physical school. So Venka, we've had children out of school for many months, learning remotely or digitally. And I do think it's very much forced a different type of question about the value of school as a place of co-location, cohabitation, of being together. And this is not on the basis of research. This is just me imbibing the media and listening to friends with young children still about the yearning children had to return to school, the yearning parents had for children to return to school. And so I began to think of the way in which that created a space of possibility for thinking about the school, as a potentially more, opening up the care and social dimensions of school, so that, you could look at, this sounds so corny, I can't believe I'm saying it, but, the well-being of the school, so if you're thinking about it's the emotional culture of the school that we kind of want to be looking at, it seems to me, as much as the sort of resourcing and all the sort of structural elements that make things a good school. But something happens at school that people want beyond instruction, beyond learning. It's partly friends, but there is this other sense of connection. So I'm wondering whether there are ways in which well-being might take a genuinely deeper move, perhaps in the eudaimonic, the ways you were talking about, Venka, but that it's a moment to really grab that term and make it do something a bit more productive in a collective sense, seems to me.
Yeah, and I mean, the lockdowns showed all over the world that now in Denmark it has been established, you say, yearning, like the school, the longing for the school as a new phenomenon, which we never talked about before.
Yeah.
We have school anxiety, fears, truancy, and all kind
I
of.
don't want to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, so there is something there, that school as a place, as a physical material place, and what goes on there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is obviously very relevant and very significant for children and young people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating thing for us to give some further consideration to, and perhaps a nice place to end, unless there are any further thoughts or comments or reflections that either of you would like to add before we finish up.
Oh, I think we can go on forever, but I guess there are some limitations, even in the virtual room.
No, but it's been a very, for me, really stimulating to try and think afresh about these, because I think there are but there are some, lots of critical and lots of positive things to say about it, but how you can actually shake up even your own analyses, I think, and try and look at things afresh is always a challenge, and it's one of the joys of academic life. Yeah. So thank you, Katie, and thank you, Venka.
Yes, same here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both. It's been an incredibly stimulating conversation, and I would like to extend my thanks and thanks on behalf of the cluster for joining us. It's been a real treat for me, and I hope that our audience has enjoyed it as much as I have. So just before we wind up, just a couple of thank yous. I would like to thank Tim Andrews and Amy Cook for their brilliant work organising this event and the one I mentioned earlier, which was held last week. I'd also like to thank the School of Humanities and Social Sciences for supporting the Wellbeing Cluster and making possible the sorts of fascinating conversations that we've been able to have this evening. Thank you to the audience for coming along, and thank you to my colleagues in the Wellbeing Cluster for your contributions too. But thank you so much, Julie and Venka. It was a real pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.